Hello friends, my name is JJ, and I just spent 2 weeks in London, my first trip to England in more than 20 years. And I went there in part because there were a couple of hyper-specific British things that I wanted to learn more about, things that I've always been fascinated by as symbols of some of the broader themes of British culture. So I bought 10 things that represent 10 things, and today we're going to talk about those 10 things in order to talk about 10 themes. I think it's going to be a nice little journey because each theme flows naturally into the next one. Make sense? Let's go. So the first object I got was a gift from my British YouTuber pal Chris of Half Asleep Chris fame. It's a little figurine of this strange British character known as Mr. Blobby. And I've always found him to be a very fascinating creation for how he embodies this very distinctly British love of comedic chaos. So the British are often stereotyped as being a very uptight and unemotional people, obsessed with order and propriety. The Brits themselves often attribute this to the trauma of World War II, which made a whole generation extremely defensive and fearful of disorder. And one interesting byproduct of this was the emergence of aggressively chaotic, annoying characters as a stock presence in British comedy. These were characters who cheerfully caused mayhem, where British people were used to expecting stability, thereby producing comedy gold. Mr. Bean would probably be the most famous example of this, but a lot of the humor in classic British shows like Fawlty Towers and Monty Python are based on this premise as well. Mr. Blobby was a character who debuted in the 1990s and took this premise to its most absurd extreme. He was a guy in this big inflatable costume who would make cameo appearances on other people's shows and proceed to be as annoying and chaotic as possible, and thereby ruin anyone's hope of maintaining any dignity or self-respect.
Okay, well thank you very much indeed for coming in and for being on your best blobby behaviour. Thank you very much. We'll be back again tomorrow. So from me and Mr. Blobby, and not Mr. Blobby, bye-bye.
The sheer anarchic nonsense of this character has always struck me as like the perfect yin to the yang of British uptightedness. British people value order, but they also know that they tend to overvalue it. So I feel like chaos-based comedy has long been a way in which the Brits sort of try to knowingly humble themselves a bit. Now, even though he was originally created for grown-up TV, Mr. Blobby proved to be enormously popular with British kids. And in that sense, I think he's also a good symbol of the sort of weird and grotesque characters who tend to thrive in British children's media. Indeed, Mr. Blobby's original backstory was that he was supposed to be the wandering star of some fictitious British children's show. The British have always struck me as having a very good sense of how fascinated children are by characters that sort of straddle the line between cute and terrifying. Like, here's a doll that I bought in Brighton. It's a character called Zippy from a British kids show called Rainbow that I remember watching with morbid glee as a child in the 1980s. He was this puppet thing with a zipper for a mouth who was friends with an equally unsettling pink hippo.
I'm a jelly baby, Zippy. What a pal!
If you've seen the popular British YouTube series Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared, it is very obviously intended to be a kind of horror send-up of shows like this. And another retro kids character who I think fits into this category is Dizzy the Egg. Dizzy was a popular British video game character in the 1980s and 90s who starred in such classic hits as Treasure Island Dizzy and Dizzy Down the Rapids. The Brits love him so much they even put him on a stamp. I've been learning all about him because another one of my British YouTuber friends, Daniel Ibertson of Slope's Game Room, was actually kind enough to give me this excellent book on the history of the Oliver twins, the British brothers who invented Dizzy and founded Codemasters, an iconic British video game company from the retro era. Now, even if you consider yourself a hardcore retro gaming enthusiast, chances are high that if you live outside of Britain, you have never heard of the Dizzy series before. And in that sense, he is my chosen symbol of our second British cultural theme of the day, which is cultural sovereignty. But before we get to that, let us just hear a quick word from today's video sponsor, Incogni. Hello friends, so check this out. This is a miniature version of a popular British vacuum cleaner brand called Henry Hoover, and there's nothing he loves more than hoovering up all sorts of dirt and grime. But did you know that your personal information is being hoovered up online as well, and by characters much less cute and cuddly than old Henry over here? It's true. Over the years, we've all blindly submitted a lot of personal information to online stores and social media sites and dating apps and whatnot, and much of that information in turn has been sold off to big data brokerage companies who have in turn sold it off to God only knows. But it's your information, and if you don't like the thought of shady companies buying and selling detailed profiles of you and your various proclivities, then it might be time to check out today's video sponsor, Incogni. Incogni is a very cool app that submits formal requests to data brokerage companies, politely yet firmly asking them to delete whatever they have on you. In most Western countries, these sorts of requests are ones that the companies are legally obligated to obey, but since most people don't have Incogni to submit them for them, they never get around to it. I mean, fair enough, check this out. If I had done it myself, it would have taken over 112 hours to file the 150 data deletion requests that they have done for me so far. If this sounds like a service you might be into, just head over to incogni.com/JJMCC or use the promo code JJMCC for an incredible 60% off any annual plan. It is an incredibly easy to use app that will surely make your online experience much more award-winning. So don't delay, stop letting yourself get hoovered online, and give Incogni a try today. When we think of Britain's place in the modern world, it is easy to fixate on the idea that they are a fading power who has lost their empire and yada yada. But the fact is, Britain is still one of the wealthiest countries in the entire world, and in the top 10% of countries by population size as well. Countries that large and wealthy can usually sustain a very powerful domestic entertainment industry, and Britain is no exception. I've always been fascinated by the fact that prior to the emergence of the internet, it was very easy for British people to live pretty culturally insulated lives in which they would only watch British TV shows and read British magazines and follow British sports and listen to British bands and play British video games. Retro British video games have always been the most disorienting manifestation of this phenomenon, just because I think that those of us in the rest of the world are very used to taking it for granted that video games in the 80s and 90s only came out of Japan and America. But no, Britain had its own indigenous video game scene too, and it remains a source of distinctly British nostalgia. Here is another thing Daniel gave me, a boxed set of the Horace series. Horace being another one of these grotesque characters that the kids loved. So we have Hungry Horace, Horace Goes Skiing, and of course, Horace and the Spiders. Horace was actually created by an Australian, but he was hugely popular in the UK. Now you might notice that these games don't look like games for any system that you've ever seen, and that's because they are for the ZX Spectrum, one of Britain's homegrown video game systems. Instead of using cartridges or discs, it used cassette tapes, which was honestly not a technology I was even aware you could put video games on. But Dizzy and Horace and all of the other goblins got their start on this system, and for British millennials, its big, clumsy keyboard is a symbol of classic gaming, as iconic as the rectangular NES controller. When a country has a high degree of cultural sovereignty, its traditions become easy for outsiders to exoticize, which I guess is basically what I'm doing in this video. And often that exoticizing manifests in the form of obsessing over a few highly recognizable objects that seem to embody the uniqueness of that foreign culture, which leads to the rise of cultural cliches, which is the next theme we're going to discuss. So there is a ton of cliched objects that we have come to associate with Great Britain, including double-decker buses, those helmets the cops wear, black umbrellas, little bowler-style hats. And here are two more examples, which I bought in the form of these little crocheted keychains that I got at the Spitalfields Market. Can you tell what they are? I'm a big fan of when complex objects can be reduced to incredibly stylized representations. In this case, these things are little more than blobs of colored yarn, but if you know your British cliches, you can probably tell what they're supposed to be. This is a mailbox, and this is a telephone booth. Every country has mailboxes, and until recently, most countries had telephone booths too. So the fact that the British versions of these things look so distinctive has made them easy to fixate on as symbols of British cultural uniqueness over the years. The British tourism industry certainly seems to operate on the assumption that these things are of enormous fascination to foreigners, given how many souvenirs are churned out based on them. Red telephone booths have been found in England since the 1920s, which was when telephones themselves first started to go mainstream. For a time, they had blue telephone boxes too, for emergency calls to the police. And I noticed that in a few spots in London, they have black telephone boxes now too, offering a free Wi-Fi connection, which is kind of cool. But overall, the trend in England has been towards getting rid of telephone booths, which are obviously useless in a country where everybody has their own cell phone. A lot of the surviving ones in London are now used for tourist photo ops, like this one in front of Big Ben, which always has a huge lineup of young women waiting patiently to take the perfect selfie. Some of the other booths are being repurposed in more creative ways. You can see in Surrey, I saw one that is being repurposed into one of those community libraries where people put their useless books instead of throwing them out. So that's something. British red mailboxes, by contrast, are still going strong. They're operated by the Royal Mail, which is a now private corporation that continues to operate public mailboxes as part of the terms of their privatization. Before the Royal Mail was privatized, their mailboxes would always display the cipher or logo of the current British king or queen, which is a common symbol of government property in the UK. Given how long she was around for, most British post boxes have the cipher of Queen Elizabeth II, but it can be fun to try to find ones with the cipher of some of the older kings or queens. There was some news recently that King Charles has graciously allowed some of the new privately built royal mailboxes to use his cipher, because, you know, he's generous like that, which is a good transition into our next cultural theme, which is royalty. Next to post boxes and telephone booths, and of course, Big Ben, there is nothing you see more on British souvenirs than images of the royal family. Check out these two little rubber ducks I bought at a souvenir stand. This one is done up to look like the late Queen Elizabeth, while this one looks like good old King Chucky. Britain has undoubtedly the most famous royal family in the entire world, a family that has pretty much set the standard for how royal people should behave and act in the modern age of democracy and mass media. A lot of this owes to the fact that one of the defining projects of British history has been trying to establish a political system in which a country can be free of the sort of tyranny traditionally associated with monarchy, while also retaining the sense of national unity and patriotism that a revered monarch can bring. And the idea that they came up with was so-called constitutional monarchy, where the members of the royal family are basically just powerless figureheads employed by the government to serve as patriotic mascots for the country. And it's proven to be a pretty popular and workable model, and one that's been copied everywhere from Luxembourg to Japan. What I'm curious about these days, however, is whether Britain also winds up being the country that models a path out of constitutional monarchy. British intellectuals certainly seem to be debating the future of the monarchy more openly than ever. You can't visit a London bookstore these days without coming across plenty of books and magazines making the case in favor of abolishing the royal family. The democratic arguments are obvious, but it does seem like there is also increasing awareness of the degree that putting people in a royal family kind of psychologically screws them up. But that said, one of the strongest rebuttals to a rising tide of anti-monarchism is just that the world-class grandness of the British royals does help make Britain more interesting to other places, and in that sense is something that helps drive British tourism and certainly tourist spending. Now, one of the things that makes British royalty so popular is the extravagance of their public ceremonies, weddings and coronations and knightings and all of that, which gets to our next theme of British culture, ritual. So here's another little crocheted plushy thing that I bought at another British market. It's supposed to be a British Christmas pudding, which is a strange object that I've been obsessed with ever since I was a little kid. I mean, I've never seen a gigantic spherical ball cake, half covered in white icing and topped with a sprig of holly on this side of the pond, but I'm still very aware of it as a symbol of traditional British Christmas, and you do sometimes see it used here as an abstract Christmas symbol as well. But if you ask a British person about this thing, I find it often gets them very sentimental and gleeful, because to them, a Christmas pudding is something very real that represents the emotional climax of their very structured and ritualized way of celebrating Christmas. According to this children's book about British Christmas, the standard sequence of events is that the children do the stockings first, and then the whole family opens the presents under the tree, and then everyone watches the king or queen give a special Christmas speech on television, and then everyone pulls on these weird things known as Christmas party crackers and puts on little paper crowns, and then there's a big Christmas dinner with all of these very particular foods that you only eat once a year, capped off with a big, beautiful Christmas pudding. And then maybe followed by playing some silly games in the living room, or singing together, and then getting drunk on British liquor. The orderliness of the stereotypical British Christmas can seem a little fussy to outsiders, but this fixation on maintaining structured and well-paced rituals, even at the domestic level, I think feels very distinctly British. Another good example would be these glossy Christmas food catalogs that some of the higher-end supermarkets put out. They're filled with all of these lovely photographs of all these things that you can order months in advance as you plan out your perfectly well-organized British Christmas dinner. One of my British friends was telling me how much his wife likes to flip through these things and get swept up in a cloud of Yuletide fantasy about the splendid British Christmas to come. So I said that these catalogs came from the higher-end supermarkets, in this case, Marks and Spencer and Waitrose. Britain has quite a lot of supermarket chains, and I noticed that British people tend to have a pretty strong sense of how classy each one is relative to another. I heard so much about this, in fact, that I was even inspired to make this little British supermarket classiness tier list. I posted it on Instagram and got mostly positive endorsements from my British followers. And I think this is a good lead-in to our next cultural theme, which is the class system. Enormous gaps between rich and poor has been one of the defining themes of British economic history, though nowadays Britain only has pretty mild levels of inequality by global standards. Yet owing to their history, a certain hyper-awareness of class remains a pronounced characteristic of British culture just the same, often in quite abstract and stylized ways. British people tend to be very aware of which social class their family has historically belonged to, upper class, middle class, or working class. And British academics will often treat the class labels that people give themselves as important sociological categories, the same way that researchers on this continent might treat race or religion. Middle-class British people tend to be quite anxious in the same way that middle-class people everywhere are. But what I find pretty amusing is the obsession of the British middle class with this concept of poshness. Posh is an adjective associated with the affect of the British upper class, their particular manners and interests and ways of speaking and all of that. But these days, I feel that Brits increasingly just use the term to make fun of middle class people who are trying to copy what they imagine to be upper class ways of behaving, and usually coming off a little cringe in the process. Before I went to London, I saw this meme, which I thought was pretty funny. My favorite British food genre is pretend posh food you thought was just for sophisticated millionaires when you were a child. And then when I got to England, I went to Romford, which I would describe as a pretty lower middle class suburban type area. And I went to the supermarket to see if I could buy all of those pretend posh foods. And of course I could. It was an Asda, by the way. See, I guarantee you a lot of British people are looking at their screens right now and are being like, yes, buying fake posh treats at the Romford Asda. That tracks. But anyway, as you can see, I got these After Eights, which are a kind of chocolate mint, and these other little chocolates, which are in the shape of seashells and kind of remind me of soap. And then we have these lovely Ferrero Rochers, which are chocolate-covered hazelnuts, which we have over here as well, but I've never considered them particularly hoity-toity, have you? The meme also had an ice cream cake called Viennetta, which I couldn't bring home with me, but I can confirm that the Romford Asda had as well. Now, what happens to the politics of a country that is so preoccupied with questions of class and inequality? Well, you tend to see a lot of support for our next cultural theme, which is socialism. So despite what right-wingers on this continent would have you believe, one thing that makes the United States and Canada different from other Western nations is that we never really had a socialist movement of any major strength. This makes us quite different from Britain, where open, explicit socialism was a major ideological force in their 20th century history. The British Labour Party, for instance, was an explicitly socialist party founded in 1900, according to Marxist principles, including that workers should control the means of production. For many decades, Labour politicians would refer to each other as comrade and attend global socialist conferences where they would sing the Internationale and all of that. But British socialism was more than just politics. It was also a cultural sensibility that influenced multiple generations of respectable British writers and artists and thinkers. And during the periods of the early post-war era, where the Labour Party ruled Britain, you could see this broader socialist sensibility shape the country in more ways than one. My favorite example is what the British call council housing, or sometimes council estates. These were apartment buildings built by Labour Party governments in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that were owned and managed by the government and provided much cheaper rent than you could get at a privately run building. This was a very literal socialist type idea in the sense of the state subverting the market to provide a product to the masses. And the simplicity of the idea means that it is one that is often sentimentalized by the British left today, in no small part because Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government in the 1980s would proceed to end the council homes program and allow the privatization of the ones that already existed. But what's most interesting to me is just how these buildings look. The Labour governments would often contract explicitly Marxist architects to build the council estates, who would in turn bring a uniquely socialist aesthetic to what they created. The apartments would often be done in hyper-modernist or brutalist styles, which today can often seem a bit dull or dreary, but at the time were seen as very futuristic and utopian, in the same way that socialism itself was considered a very futuristic, utopian ideology. There is a very cool arts and culture centre in central London, known as the Barbican. It's located in this very striking brutalist building, once intended to be a community centre for some of the surrounding council estates. And at their gift shop, I bought this, which is a book all about the council housing. It is full of some very nice photographs of some of the most iconic council apartment buildings built in the pre-Thatcher era. I also got this, which is a little cement sculpture of one of the most iconic council estates, London's Balfron Tower, built by the Hungarian-born architect Ernol Goldfinger in 1967. Goldfinger is probably one of the most famous / infamous socialist architects of post-war Britain, just because his style was so aggressively brutalist. Now, to be clear, there are plenty of council estate buildings that are nothing special to look at. Many are just these generic brick things, identifiable mostly for their white-framed windows and outdoor hallways. Given that they were intended for working-class people, a lot of Brits associate them with bad neighborhoods, and many are quite run down. But others are considered real architectural masterpieces of the post-war age, and some are even listed, which is the British term for a building that the government considers too culturally important to be demolished. The Labour Party abandoned orthodox Marxism many decades ago, but these buildings remain a lasting monument to their more doctrinaire days. Now, even if Britain never did become a socialist utopia, Their once vast gap between rich and poor did narrow quite substantially during the 20th century, which leads us to our next British cultural theme, egalitarianism. As a cultural ideal, egalitarianism is the goal of minimizing the visible differences between people of different social classes. Britain certainly has a lot of non-egalitarian things entrenched in their culture, like hereditary nobility and class-conscious supermarkets, but so too does it have a lot of institutions that proudly treat everyone equally. And I think one of the best examples of this is the beloved London Underground. The Underground is what Brits call the London subway system, which was the world's first subway, opened in 1863 and expanded endlessly ever since. And it's become the great equalizer of London society, the thing that big finance guys and politicians and immigrants, service workers, and retail clerks, and hippie students, and starving artists, and everyone else all cram into shoulder to shoulder, because of course, everyone's got a place to go. And this has helped make the subway perhaps the most beloved symbol of London to the diverse assortment of people who actually live there. The gift shop of the London Subway Museum is probably the biggest in the city. I've been to a lot of souvenir shops in my day, and this is easily the largest gift shop I've ever seen, selling such a broad range of goods, all centered around a single sentimental theme. They have art prints and pillows and pajamas and furniture and pretty much any other random thing you could imagine. I got these colorful little coasters of all the different subway lines, represented by the system's iconic logo, known as the roundel, and then this charming tea towel, which is done up in the style of the tiling at the Baker Street station. Pretty much every single aspect of the London subway, from the tiling in the stations, to the navigation signs, to the fabric used on the seat cushions, has been sacralized in some way, which I think does reflect something meaningful about the degree that British people like reveling in the activities of daily life, particularly when those experiences are so likely to be broadly shared. Or perhaps the popularity of all this stuff just reveals the power of our next cultural theme, consumerism. Today, household spending makes up about 2/3 of the British economy, which puts Britain up there with the US as one of the most consumerist societies on Earth, considerably more than some other places that we might imagine to have a big shopping culture, like Japan and Germany, where consumer spending is only about half of their economy. And what this means is that the British do spend a lot of time buying stuff and often develop a strong sense of affection for the things that they buy, even the small or frivolous things. My favorite example is this thing that you can see me holding here, which is a Colin the Caterpillar cake. This is a caterpillar-shaped cake sold at the classy M&S line of supermarkets, though I am told that the lesser supermarkets also sell caterpillar cakes of their own with different names. Over the years, caterpillar-shaped cakes have become a ubiquitous part of British birthday culture, as you can see from this charming birthday card that I bought at the train station, which says, "No Colin, no party." But what I really enjoy is just how far they go with all of this. So at M&S these days, not only can you buy Colin cakes, but you can also buy special edition Collins for Christmas and Halloween and Easter, as well as these miniature Colin cakes for school lunchboxes, and these Colin-shaped fruit gummies, and my personal favorite, these candies, which are known as Colin's Greatest Bits, that are made from the type of chocolate used to make Colin's face and legs and buttons, which I guess is the only part of the cake that some British kids like eating. Now that is some creative consumerism right there. Now, when did the British first go so hard for this type of consumerism, you ask? Well, that brings us to our final cultural theme of the day, the Victorian era. The Victorian age formally refers to the long reign of Queen Victoria, which lasted from 1837 to 1901. But as a cultural era, it is usually thought to have begun a fair bit later, like the 1850s or so. And this is because, in the more colloquial sense, Victorian Britain mostly refers to the country's emergence as an industrial powerhouse with a strong middle class, and the new ways of life that introduced. Factories, for instance, spurted up all over Britain during the mid-19th century, reflecting new innovations in the production of steel and steam power. Many of these factories, in turn, produced the sort of household goods that would proceed to become the backbone of British consumerism. Some of the companies behind these factories are still in business today and often like to lean into their Victorian roots, keeping the same logos and in some cases even the same manufacturing process some 150 years later. Here are two examples of Victorian-era products still made today that I find British people have a lot of affection for. This is a good one. This is Wright's coal tar soap, produced by the Wright Corporation of Wiltshire since 1860. It is a wonderfully Victorian product that combines both the growing middle-class awareness of the importance of being clean with two of the most beloved Victorian-era industrial substances, coal and tar. Although it says it is now merely coal tar scented. So I guess soap technology has marched onward a bit since the 1860s. The scent is definitely very distinctive, and British people will often say it reminds them of their grandparents, who have presumably stayed loyal to the same brand of soap that their own grandparents bought in the late 1800s. And then we have this, a jar of Robertson's marmalade, made by James Robertsons and Sons of Manchester since 1864. Marmalade, as we all know, is a kind of jelly made of mashed up oranges, which in Victorian times would have been considered a pretty impressively luxurious product for middle-class people to be able to afford. Oranges were once a very expensive and exotic fruit from Spain, so the idea that Britain's industrial wealth and power had made it possible to produce marmalade on a mass scale was a real symbol of the thrilling progress of the Victorian times. A proud British achievement which lives on today in the form of Paddington Bear. It is really quite remarkable just how many aspects of British culture are still lingering in the shadow of Victorianism in some way. People want the monarchy to be as grand as it was in Victorian times. They want Christmas to be as cozy and romantic as it was in Victorian times. And I would even argue that a lot of the salience of class in British culture and politics is tied to long memories of the social divisions of the Victorian times. But now it is time for this video to end. Thank you so much for watching. If you are a non-Brit like me, let me know in the comments if there is any aspect of British culture that you have found particularly interesting. And I guess actual Brits can chime in too. Why not? Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next week.